Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. Incredibly painful crisis of homelessness, which has reached record high levels in many cities over recent years and will only continue to get worse amid economic fallout and displacement related to the pandemic. On a morning early last month in San Antonio, Texas, city officials gathered outside a makeshift tent camp underneath Interstate 37. It's near downtown. And they ordered the people living there to leave. Although the CDC has advised cities not to clear encampments during the pandemic, workers spent the next few hours dismantling this camp and sweeping away any sign that as many as 100 people had been taking shelter there and calling that area home for the previous few months. As outreach workers checked the tents, they found a 6-week-old baby living with her unhoused mother. Child Protective Services workers took the baby. They left the distraught 23-year-old in tears. This is all according to a report from the San Antonio Express. Officials have since defended the sweep, saying it was a necessary response to concerns about crime and unhealthy living conditions, concerns that some of the people who were actually living at the camp said were overblown. The city had initially delayed the sweep, giving outreach workers time to contact residents and attempt to connect them with resources for unhoused people. But even after that delay, some city council members say they were left without any answers to the most critical question. Where were these people expected to go? Where did they go? The potential consequences of that uncertainty have become only more severe in recent weeks when a winter storm blasted Texas, bringing frigid temperatures and leaving advocates scrambling to track down people who were desperately in need of shelter. Now, the early February sweep is just the latest example of cities like San Antonio dumping huge amount of money into sweeps, which are an ineffective, inhumane whack-a-mole approach to the homelessness crisis. Since 2017, San Antonio has reportedly spent more than $1.7 million to clear at least 500 encampments. And officials have said they now intend to continue to remove people at least once a week. But those sweeps don't address the underlying issue, which is that people are living in a camp because they don't have access to stable, affordable housing. By choosing to respond to the visible consequences of the underlying problem instead of going to the root causes of the problem itself, the city is further displacing the unhoused community and also making it much harder for them to find long-term housing stability. Now, elected officials in San Antonio and other cities across the country are increasingly exploring alternatives to this approach. In recent weeks, San Antonio City Councilman Roberto Treviño has been leading discussions on purchasing a hotel to house those who have no permanent place to live. The proposal would follow a similar move in Austin, Texas, where the city council recently voted to purchase 2 hotels to provide permanent supportive housing for residents experiencing homelessness. The operating costs for that program are set to be paid for with money diverted from Austin's police budget. For more on how these officials are responding to issues of homelessness in their communities, I am so excited to be joined now by San Antonio City Councilman Treviño and Austin City Councilman Greg Casar. Thank you both so much for being with me today.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
Councilman Treviño, we're going to start with you, and I want to ask you for like a status update. So I admit that as a mom, that detail about a mother holding her 6-week-old baby, having that baby taken away, hit me really hard, and I can't stop thinking about it. And I was hoping if you could give us an update both on what's happened with that encampment, and also if you know anything about whether this mother has been reunified with her baby. I'd love to hear the latest on that as well.
Well, I thank you for drawing attention to such a difficult issue, and you're absolutely right. We have far too many tragic stories like that exist because of these encampment cleanups. And you stated it perfectly well. Where were these people expected to go? Many of them were just actually asked to move to the other side of the street while they watched everything get thrown in the trash and just wait until everybody left so they can move back into that space. It was just awful. And, I don't support these kinds of efforts. And it really highlights one of the issues you brought up as well, which was the fact that we're spending a lot of money doing something that doesn't work. And it includes our police department that will tell you the exact same thing. This doesn't work. As far as the child and the mother, the child is with protective services. We have located the mother. We're working to reconnect them. We are in constant contact. Again, these are very, very difficult issues. And at the heart of this is understanding that there's so many of these tragic stories. We want to meet these issues where the people want their needs met. And so we've got to find a way to do this much better.
I hadn't realized that people were asked to step aside as all of the sort of safety net they'd built for themselves was destroyed and then just left to go back under an overpass with nothing. I'm wondering if you could drill down a little bit for me, Councilman Treviño, on what these tactics say to you about the attitude of San Antonio's response towards the homelessness crisis up until this point, the sort of past mechanisms the city has used in dealing with this crisis?
Well, what it says to me is that we're hiding from the issue, and we're hiding behind our police department. We're hiding behind these protocols that we know simply don't work. And we say that it's a public safety issue. We say that it's any number of things that really aren't cutting to the heart of the situation, which is a human issue. And so we've got to find a better way. We have really done something with our outreach specialists here in San Antonio to go out there to talk to many of the people who are in crises and understand what are their issues. How can we meet them where they need those services? And we need to invest more in that. Right now, we're only given about a 48-hour notice of outreach to a lot of these encampments, and then we just go in and tear everything out. The city manager basically wants a solution in 48 hours for people who are in crises. And in this case, it was hundreds of people that, you're just not going to get there like that. Again, the folks were asked to move to one side, and then they just moved back in, and then they hunkered down when this winter storm hit. 3 of them actually traveled 5 miles to get to my field office, which was where I'm located, to get some help and support. It's just not a tenable situation.
No. Well, turning towards solutions. So, Councilman Casar, I'm hoping you can give me some information about how this issue played out in Austin. And I know the decision to purchase these 2 hotels to house people experiencing homelessness was made recently, but I'd love to hear sort of give me the inside baseball. What were the discussions leading up to this? How were you able to make this breakthrough and do this innovative thing in Austin?
Well, for too long, just like in San Antonio and in other cities across the country, Austin had employed the same strategy of trying to hide homelessness rather than solve it. And then homelessness grows and grows and grows, especially as the rent goes up, especially as the federal government continued to abdicate its responsibility to provide truly low income and public housing. And so homelessness has continued to grow in our city. And just recently, our city council made the right decision and the brave decision to say, let's stop trying to deal with homelessness just with handcuffs and instead address it with homes so that we can actually reduce homelessness in our community in a real way. And that has opened up the opportunity for us to have the resources necessary for us to start purchasing housing for folks that are unhoused so that we can actually reduce homelessness in our city. So near the end of last year, we actually purchased our first 2 hotels, but we started running into roadblocks around how we would purchase the next ones. Because even though the city had dollars available to purchase the hotels, if you actually want to maintain them and charge little to no rent and provide the level of healthcare services that folks coming off the street need, then we needed money, not just to buy the hotel, but to run it. And that's why we made as part of the changes that we made to our policing budget that reinvested dollars away from mass incarceration as a strategy for addressing social issues and over to actual care and solutions. And so we moved some of those dollars over that made it so that we could buy 2 more. So the city council has actually now voted to purchase 4 hotels. And I'm hoping that in the coming weeks, we buy another one and another one, because these hotels don't take as long to provide the solution. And instead of building shelters or trying to build permanent supportive housing, we already have these hotels that are sometimes sitting halfway or fully empty because travel has been reduced so much during the pandemic. It's already a solution, already in place, and we can move folks from under bridges to the hotels that are right across the street, provide them housing, and frankly, it's also more cost effective for us to be providing the solution rather than continued spending on trash pickups and sweeps and incarceration that we know doesn't solve the problem. And in many cases, for many families, like the mother you described, can make things worse.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit because, I mean, I'm a former public defender. For me, it's super obvious that, like, when you give people housing, stability, medical care, you are increasing safety more than if you do the bulk of, like, the bulk of police enforcement is, like, you know, dog barking calls and public urination and trespassing tickets and the sort of low level enforcement that can be very disruptive. But I'm wondering what resistance you've had to reallocating those dollars and what arguments you found to be the most effective in terms of helping people see that this is an investment in public safety, even though it's reallocating funding away from policing.
When we decided to stop calling it a crime just to be sleeping outside because you have nowhere else to go, the fear mongering we started getting from state officials and from cynical political actors just continues to be, there is a lot of fear mongering. I'm not even going to try to characterize it more than there's just so much. But the fact of the matter is, even as our governor says that he's going to ban homelessness and he's going to ban it under a bridge and send a sweep, the fact of the matter is, as an everyday person living in the community, you can see that banning homelessness by criminal law doesn't end it. As Councilmember Treviño mentioned, folks may be swept out from under a bridge for a day or two. And then if people don't have anywhere to go, they'll just be right back. And so I think the best response in the community has been to actually show results, to show that there actually is a way to end homelessness for hundreds, if not thousands of people in our community. Because it wasn't that long ago that we actually had so much less homelessness in America as we know it today. Before the Reagan era, a lot of federal intervention really kept the numbers of people that were chronically homeless much lower, but based on our population size. And so when people have the actual hope that there's something we can do other than just criminalize people and punish poverty, when people see that there's a potential solution, then I think that people all across the political spectrum can buy into that. And also, as far as these hotels go, we've also set a goal for us to buy a hotel in every single city council district so that no one part of the community feels like that's where all of the hotels are going to go, but that everyone understands that we all have a shared responsibility and opportunity to address homelessness.
That's so interesting and kind of defeating the NIMBY problem right off the bat. Councilman Treviño, I want to turn to you and ask, where does this debate stand in San Antonio? Is progress happening a mile a minute? Is there resistance? What's going on in your town?
There's some resistance, as you can tell, based on the way we're rolling out the news around encampments instead of ways that we're going to actually help our homeless. And first, I got to start off by just commending Councilman Casar and the Austin City Council. We have a lot to live up to when it comes to what Austin is doing for its unhoused population. I mean, they're setting the example. I mean, to be on the fourth hotel and we haven't even gotten to our first, it's appalling. And it's because I think we're focused on enforcement and focused on having police solve these issues and scoot people from point A to point B rather than meeting people where their needs are. And you know, Councilman Casar was mentioning that there's a lot of fear mongering. Well, it also takes a lot of courage to admit that you want to find a solution. You know, you want that courage to find a solution that helps people really get them off the street and provide those humanitarian services that we all know we find ourselves in the middle of a crisis any day. We saw that the entire state of Texas found itself in a storm where a lot of the issues that we were facing as a state are issues that our homeless population faces every single day. You were insecure about water. You were insecure about food. You were worried about a roof over your head. You didn't know when you were going to have any services. It was an amazing time to reflect on the insecurities that our cities can feel and why we need to provide a social safety net that protects all of us. We take that, and then we can, if we can provide those services for our homeless, for our most vulnerable, we can turn that back around and focus those when it's a crisis for everybody. We can help everyone. That's at the heart of this. And I've asked about where we are on the hotel purchase. It seems to be dragging out. I hope to hear something sooner than later, but it's certainly not going at the speed that the Austin City Council is moving.
So when you think about who among your peers is not quite at that point of courageousness that you describe, right? Like, this is a moment when leaders need to be courageous to do something really meaningful for their constituents whose needs are extreme. What do you think it's going to take to inspire that courage in your peers? And is there anything that ordinary people in your city can do to push their leaders to take that leap?
Well, it's going to take some courage from our city council and our mayor. This is something that is all too often not spoken about. And quite frankly, we're in election season, and we know our homeless population is not something that a lot of elected officials cater to during a campaign season, so it can be touchy. But at the heart of this is we're proving that there are ways to help solve a lot of issues. There is no finish line, but we can provide a path or a framework that is helping our community in a meaningful way. And again, to have examples right up the highway from us in Austin to demonstrate that there are solutions that we can all adopt, we can all work together on, is the way that this community can see that there are possibilities to help move us forward as a community.
I'm really glad you brought up that idea of kind of like a North Star and seeing progress a little bit up the highway. And also, I think both of you seem to have a vision for bigger change on this. I'd love to give you each a chance, starting with you, Councilmember Casar, to answer what does a more holistic approach more broadly to the homelessness crisis look like in your city? And what is the North Star vision? What needs to be done to get to a bigger reaction to this crisis?
I think I want to answer that question taking the step back that Councilmember Treviño just took, which is we're still in the midst of a disaster here in Texas. I still have thousands of constituents without water, but we just felt across the state how vulnerable we all really are when disaster strikes. For folks that are now experiencing homelessness, it might have been an incidence of domestic or family violence. It might have been a medical bill you just couldn't pay and a sudden loss of a job. For millions of Texans, people lost power, people lost water, people have lost their homes with pipes bursting and flooding their homes. We are all so dependent on each other, and with the pandemic on top of all of these crises, we can recognize how vulnerable we all truly are and how important it is for us to come together and address the crises of the pandemic or of climate change, or in these winter storms, to address those crises with a democracy that actually takes care of each of us and recognizes that we all need to support one another. And if we actually have that as our guiding star, as our guiding principle, then it makes absolutely no sense in cities as prosperous as Austin or San Antonio, a state as prosperous as Texas, for us to have any people who are living on the street. Because when those winter storms came and 0-degree temperatures came to Texas day after day, then there were people who were already exposed to the virus, who were going to be exposed to 0-degree temperatures. And for years, we had neglected having a safe place for folks to go. And the same way that we had neglected protecting our grid and our electric infrastructure from shutting down, in the same way we had failed to provide the level of healthcare support and paid sick time for people who've been exposed to this virus. And so for me, the guiding North Star is that absolutely we have to house hundreds and thousands more people experiencing homelessness in our cities. But then we also have to recognize that our democracy really should be built to solve those problems. And if we can't pull folks in off the street, if our democracy isn't functional enough to deal with the people who are dying in our communities under bridges, then how can we expect our democracy here in Texas to address the climate crisis, to address food and water and healthcare for every single person? So we all have to I think, re-engage with our democracy in a new way, especially at the local and state level, to say that failures housing people experiencing homelessness aren't acceptable, because if we can't get that done, then think about all the other places that we're failing. And you saw those failures here in the last 24 hours with our governor saying we want to get rid of all of the mask rules in Texas while we are still in the throes of this pandemic. So we absolutely are facing a crisis of homelessness in our communities, facing the crisis of the pandemic, the continued water and power crisis, and a crisis with our democracy. And it's that crisis with our democracy that we have to address if we ever hope to address the other issues. But I am really hopeful at the same time that we can, because we saw in this winter storm how neighbors who didn't have power were still taking their spare blankets to shelters for folks experiencing homelessness, how electric workers were up on power lines in the ice and snow at 3 a.m. getting power back to people. I think that people in our state do want to see that change. They do want to see homelessness ended. They just want to see the path for how we can do it. And I think these hotels are part of that path, where we don't say we're just going to put a Band-Aid on this, move people around, maybe house 50 or 100 people a year off the street, even though 100 more are going to become homeless at the same time. No, we can actually house hundreds and hundreds of people a year if we move quickly and buy these buildings and cut through the red tape and get it done. Then I think people can have hope that our democracy can actually solve the problems that they want to see solved. And if we address this, then I think it provides hope that we can address lots of the other issues that Texans want to see us address.
I'm so glad you mentioned that aspect of our shared vulnerability and the sort of extremely pointed relief that was thrown into by the weather crisis. Councilmember Treviño, I'd love for you to weigh in on that, especially as it relates back to an election season in which voters are in this very strange position of having our shared vulnerability be quite obvious, and also encountering state leadership that is very every person for themselves, best of luck out there. And what you see playing out in terms of that path towards your North Star.
Well, thank you. And number one, I just want to echo everything that Councilmember Casar said. Really, it's great to hear that there are communities and people like Councilman Casar out there fighting for our homeless population, for those that feel voiceless. My guiding North Star on this is our homeless themselves. Stop walking by them. Stop ignoring them. If you get to know somebody that is in the state of homelessness, you'll learn a lot. You'll learn that this is somebody that you might have to take the time to listen to what got them to that situation. You'll have to take the time to judge yourself whether you have the courage to do something about it. Because really, again, this storm did put all of us in such an ironic situation where we found all ourselves very vulnerable. During the storm, in fact, actually before, we anticipated that this was going to be a problem. I actually mentioned to the city manager before winter started that I wanted a plan for what we're going to do since we don't have a place for many of them to go. I asked about a warming shelter. I asked about hotels. I asked about even warming buses that other cities have provided in their communities, with zero to no response. And so, at the heart of that is because, quite frankly, nobody else is speaking up for them. And so what we did is we had to house over 30 people across the street at a hotel. And we did that ourselves through private donations. And, the amazing part of that story was that I was staying here in this field office to make sure everything was fine. We lost power here, but the hotel never lost any power. During that time, it was our homeless population that was housed with power at the hotel that kept asking if we were okay. Do we need our batteries recharged? Do we need any water? Do we need anything? I've learned quite a lot. And I've learned a lot from my outreach specialists. I've learned a lot from our homeless themselves and how much they care about one another, how they take care of one another, how they're human beings. And simply saying good morning to somebody is something that we should be very cognizant of. It's not just a simple platitude. It's acknowledging that somebody is important. It's acknowledging that somebody exists, and that if you're willing to take that step, then I think everything else follows. What we're doing is, as I said before, we're hiding from the issue. What we want is an immediate relief, and we want somebody like the police to come in and just haul them off. In many cases, some in the community don't mind if they go to jail, and that's really just very unfortunate. When it comes to the elections, I think our message is clear. We're here to help everyone, and whoever knocks on our door and asks for help, we're going to help them. And I think in my community, at least in my district, the center city, people have been incredibly supportive. I've seen so many folks come out to say, they really appreciate this, especially after this incredible storm that impacted all of us. Our seniors are most vulnerable. They're still, as Councilmember Casar mentioned, many pipes that still need to be fixed. We have an aging infrastructure that needs to be addressed. A lot of it in some of our most vulnerable and poor neighborhoods. So these are the kinds of things that we need to understand, that a social safety net, an agreement that we've got to be there for our community, because essentially the municipality almost always is the last line of defense for our community. So those are my guiding stars with regards to this issue.
You guys are both clearly really selfish, because you seem to derive so much joy from helping people that I think you're just doing this job because it makes you happy. So I want to end by giving you, Councilmember Casar, a chance to talk about protests. Because in your city, we've been presenting a very rosy picture of what's happening in Austin. But I've seen reports that there are residents and business owners protesting plans to expand the hotel purchasing program. Can you talk a little bit about why they're against the idea? But then also, I'd love to give you a chance to respond to people who may be watching this and thinking, I want all that money to go back to the police. I don't want to spend any money on hotels. Like, clear out the encampments and let's be done.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to paint a rosy picture of what's happening in Austin, because we still have hundreds of folks sleeping on the street. And in response to the winter storms, the city housed hundreds of people, but failed to house others. And it was volunteers, like you heard about in San Antonio, folks at Austin Mutual Aid, you can go find online and then even donate to, who also housed hundreds of people in hotels in that storm. And we're certainly having to deal with fear mongering, and then also sometimes confusion. As we've had community members come and say that they're against some of the hotels being purchased, oftentimes there isn't the understanding that there is also services being provided at the hotels, that we are connecting people to job aid and making sure that we get folks back on their feet. It's also really important for folks to recognize that folks experiencing homelessness are already living in every part of our community. And that ultimately the question is, do we want folks living in sleeping bags in the park or under the bridge or in a hotel where they have adequate food and adequate shelter and care and a connection to the services that can help them end their homelessness? We also have gone and shown people the hotels in action now that we have multiple of them rented or purchased. And I think those tours really help folks understand that ultimately this is just low-income housing. It's just very, very low-income housing. We've essentially converted a hotel to an apartment building with services, and that folks want to live in this housing, and that it ultimately helps end and address the issue of homelessness. But sometimes when folks feel like it's just them or just their neighborhood, that can be a challenge, and that's why we've decided, well, let's try to put one in every single district. I also want to recognize that we're facing fear-mongering and backlash, not just from everyday individuals who might live near one of these hotel sites, but also from the governor and from a campaign led out of the local Republican Party headquarters to have an initiative on the ballot to recriminalize homelessness in Austin here in May. It's known as Proposition B. And so this organization run out of the Republican Party office has essentially collected signatures, which has put this back on the ballot for a referendum. So voters here in May will decide whether or not we want to make it a criminal offense to not have anywhere to go and to be forced to sleep outdoors, or whether we should continue on this path that we've just started on of actually trying to provide housing. And so for folks watching, if you follow the social media for Homes Not Handcuffs here in Austin, you can see the efforts to support the path of actually addressing houselessness with homes, as opposed to throwing folks in jail for a night, having folks come back out worse for it, and not actually fixing the problem.
Yes.
Homes do sound better than handcuffs. Thank you both. Yes, Councilmember
I add
Treviño.
one thing to that, and I would just add that part of our problem is that we're criminalizing homelessness. There's little things that we do as municipalities, like the access to public restrooms. The fact that there's a lot of a pushback towards public restrooms, and many businesses shut down their access, really creates an opportunity for police to then arrest somebody who has nowhere to go to the restroom, and then has this other thing to deal with now, because we don't provide that. Now, I just want to point out that it's those little things, those little nuances that further exacerbate the issue of criminalizing homelessness. It's at least it's in our San Antonio City Code. I imagine that it is in Austin's. It's part of the plumbing code. The reality is most businesses are not allowed to restrict who can use their restroom, and I think that needs to be highlighted, and that takes courage.
Absolutely. It's always good for people to be informed of those rights as well as others, and for business owners to be reminded of certain rules that are in place to increase inclusivity in that manner. But I want to thank you both so much for being here, for talking about this issue, for helping people understand what is happening in your region. I'm very excited by our conversation today, and really hoping that we get to talk with you both again soon to find out what's happening. Maybe we can talk again in 2 months when there's like 50 hotels that have been bought.
That'd be great. Thank you all so much.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us. So, as the homelessness crisis continues to worsen during the pandemic, you just heard officials in cities like Austin and San Antonio that are beginning to explore what feels like it should be a really simple solution, right? Like, people don't have houses. That's a problem. Let's create houses for people. Let's create options. Let's not build something new. Let's not build something from scratch. Let's buy something that's not being used. Let's put that money back into the community and use a space that already exists to solve a really dangerous problem. Because let's remember, in a storm like we just saw in Texas, this is a potentially lethal problem. Even without a big storm, it's a potentially lethal problem. Proposals to house people in hotels, as San Antonio City Council member Roberto Treviño and Austin City Councilman Greg Casar just talked about, reveal how ineffective the approach to homelessness still is in so many places. The presence of homeless encampments is a function of a rather obvious problem, right? Nobody is living under a bridge because they had the option to live in a safe, wonderful house and chose not to. People are living under bridges because of massive civic failures on the part of the jurisdiction in which they live. People there don't have access to safe, affordable housing. And of course, there are many complicated reasons for that. And we can talk from entrenched racial and economic inequality to burdensome housing programs that put 400 different bureaucratic requirements on a person's application so that it becomes really, really impossible to enter. Programs that keep people with criminal records out, making the jail cycle an even bigger barrier to stability and success for people who are experiencing homelessness. Rampant real estate speculation. That's driven up the price of housing in many cities. There are so many reasons for this. But sweeping people out of an encampment, seizing and throwing away their belongings, does nothing to solve the underlying problems. It temporarily pushes aside visible manifestations of these problems, but it actually compounds the root cause, because you're further destabilizing and harming people and families, making this harder and more expensive to address. So very happy to be able to bring you this story today about elected officials in San Antonio, Austin, and hopefully elsewhere, beginning to wake up to the absurdity of that approach and choosing instead to invest in front-end upstream solutions to provide housing, safe, affordable housing with services and care and support to people experiencing homelessness. It's not just the humane thing to do. It is a smarter policy solution that pays for itself. You can find out more always here on The Appeal Live. You can follow us on Facebook or Twitter. I'm Emily Galvin-Almanza. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivin. This past May, the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis sparked a national uprising. And as more people across the country watched the video of this death, protesters woke up to a reality that Black and brown communities face every single day. That police departments across this country frequently act with impunity. They abuse their power and they take the lives of people of color without consequence. But even before this past summer, we saw this kind of violence play itself out in Minnesota, with the police killings of Black men like Jamar Clark and Philando Castile, in addition to the fatal shooting of a white woman, Justine Diamond, in 2017. And while the mayor of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, had previously committed to some modest changes, including promoting diversity in the police department and disciplining officers who failed to use body cameras, none of these changes saved George Floyd. And activists and organizers in Minneapolis say that reforming the police department is simply impossible. They say that the culture, the design, the function of that department doesn't keep people safe, and instead hurts people and commits violence against them. And so the only way to fix the department, they say, is to minimize its footprint. And some city council members have listened to that message. In June, following the uprisings after George Floyd's killing, council members with a veto-proof majority vowed to disband the police department and replace it with something new, a Department of Public Safety and Violence Prevention. And that department would be responsible for providing public safety services and prioritizing a holistic, public health-oriented approach. And one of our guests today, Councilmember Jeremiah Ellison, voted in favor of that initiative. And in the months following that vote, the ballot measure faced significant legal, political, and technical challenges. The Minneapolis Charter Commission, which is an unelected body that approves of ballot measures, blocked the council's efforts to put this question of dismantling the police department to voters. And while some council members have continued to push plans to reduce the footprint of the police, the city council recently voted to spend $6.4 million to hire dozens more police officers. But the people who have been working for change in Minneapolis aren't finished. Organizers in the area are now working to get voter signatures for a charter amendment to finish the job that council members promised to start last June. And so here to talk a little bit more about these efforts and the efforts to tackle policing altogether in Minneapolis, I am so pleased to be joined by our guests today, City Council Member Jeremiah Ellison and Elianne Farhat, Executive Director of Take Action Minnesota. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Council Member, I'd like to start with you. Can you talk to us a little bit about what happened to that measure? What were all of the legal, political, technical challenges that came into effect, that came into play when it came to that measure to dismantle the police department in June? And why hasn't that measure succeeded?
Yeah, I think even when we proposed it back then, we knew that there was a potential that the Charter Commission could run out the clock on us, that we had proposed it a little bit late in the year, but that we were hopeful that given the amount of engagement that the amendment got and the amount of support that it had, that the commission would understand that it was worth putting to the voters. They didn't come to that conclusion, and they did run out the clock, opting to not give any recommendation on the amendment and just sort of let it sort of die a slow bureaucratic death. But I think that the appetite for that ballot measure has proven to not have gone away. We've got a couple of council members who are still proposing charter change language, and the community and residents of the city really got involved and started to understand this process involving the Charter Commission, what the ballot measure would do and not do. And so residents have taken it upon themselves to say, hey, look, if the city council, it has some roadblocks when it comes to the Charter Commission, we have less roadblocks. We're going to go ahead and we're going to make this charter change ourselves. And I think that's what you're seeing in Minneapolis right now.
So then just to follow up on that, talk to me about the subsequent vote to allocate millions of public resources to hire more police officers, particularly for those council members who may have voted for that measure back in June. How do these two things square with each other?
Yeah, it's a little bit technical, but that money was designated for that purpose way back during the budget fight. So when you're looking at that $6.4 million, it in no way undoes or cuts into the $8 million that we reallocated elsewhere. And the vote that we took was basically a vote to say, hey, look, we committed to reducing the number of officers that we are paying for from 888 down to 750. We were way below 750. And so that's why we said, okay, we'll make good on this commitment. And it's still a reduction of the overall force.
So I'm going to shift to Elianne. Can you talk a little bit more about the history of the Minneapolis Police Department and why you believe that it needs to be disbanded?
Yeah, absolutely. When I born and raised in Minneapolis, have lived here nearly all my life. And I think for many folks who have lived here for a long time, especially folks from communities of color, Native communities, working class poor communities, we all have stories of what it has been to interact with MPD over time. And so when I think about the history of MPD, part of where I like to go is like almost back to the 60s, and the way that our community came together with the Soul Patrol on the north side, AIM Patrol on the south side and across the city, to be a presence in Black and Native communities, watching for police violence and holding police accountable and actually reducing police violence in Black and Native communities. And so from that point, that's where I like to start when I think about our experience in the city, because the reckoning around the violence and the sort of terror in communities in Minneapolis is not new, and goes even farther back than the 60s. The other place I like to think about when I think about MPD is my own experience. In high school and college, I was working in a bar in downtown Minneapolis, and there was a cop that came in all the time for free popcorn. And that cop, everybody knew, was the cop who got charged with racial discrimination when he and one of his colleagues put 2 Native American men in their trunk and abused them. And so stories like that, stories that are in our history, that we have lived throughout our lives, are very present in our city. And then, as you mentioned, there are much more recent experiences of police killings of folks in Minneapolis and across the state. And so this crisis around the terror and pain and suffering of police in Minneapolis is not new. It is only getting worse. And is really calling to question the future of public safety in our city, of the type of infrastructure we want to invest in, and being really serious and intentional about putting money into programs that will actually keep us safe. And so that's where we are today. And what I would say is right now, when we're thinking about the council members who stood up this summer and committed to dismantling MPD, it was from a very clear understanding that despite the best effort to reform MPD, despite doing all the things you're supposed to do to reform police departments and make them work better at doing their one job, which is keeping people safe, despite all that, MPD killed George Floyd. Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. And that is both his action that he will be held responsible and accountable for, and it is a symptom of a rotten system, of a rotten institution that cannot be reformed, and really calls us to move forward deeper transformations to finally fix this crisis in our city.
And so I want to follow up on that too, because a lot of times when folks are talking about how police departments cannot be reformed, but at the same time, a lot of folks say, well, you can't change the whole thing overnight. And so sort of there's this squaring between sort of modest reforms that maybe legitimize the policing system that might end up doing more harm than good, versus real reforms that might not be exactly what we want or what you want, but take us a step closer to disbandment. So I'm curious to hear from each of you, what are the sort of, if any, you also might think that no baby steps, we go straight to disbanding, but what do you think, if any, are the steps to get there? And I'll start with you, Elianne.
Yeah, I believe that we need to go through a process as a community, as a city, as a state, as a nation, as a world about that will undo the deeply nasty structures that prop up a carceral state, that prop up military interventions, and that begin to build something new. So that will take time, but that cannot be cover for not making progress. And it cannot be an excuse for not making people's lives better today and tomorrow and in the near future, as we also work to build something that will serve us for 7 generations to come, right? And so one important step that could potentially get lost in the ballot initiative that's moving forward in Minneapolis, is the deep structural reform that it's moving. So, as Jeremiah mentioned, the citizens petition, the people's petition is gathering signatures of Minneapolis citizens to put a question on the ballot that would end the police department, the Minneapolis Police Department, and instead create a Department of Public Safety, which is a really important step forward, because what we're saying as a community is that the way our government is structured, and our government as a vehicle for us to move forward the will of the people in a democracy, our central vehicle to live out our values and build our collective public infrastructure, the way it is foundationally designed right now is only going to produce bad outcomes that we don't want. And so we're taking control of our government, of our public infrastructure, and saying, we're going to reshape that. And we're going to create a department grounded in people's experiences, grounded in a public health approach to public safety, grounded in our stories and our hopes for our future, and create real space inside of our city government to house all that, and then to be a place that we can build out of. So I think that is one of the most transformational and exciting things and necessary things we in Minneapolis need to do to set up the longer term change. And then beyond that, and concurrent with that, we need to be building out the public will, the public conversations, the public engagement, and the ordinances that will enact and build out that new department.
And Councilmember, if you want to jump in here and also maybe talk a little bit about, I know the two of you work very closely on sort of getting this vision to come to fruition. So if you want to talk about that as well, feel free.
Yeah, I think the thing that's really important when it comes to making any of these changes is going to be political education and getting out there and having conversations with my constituents, with all of our neighbors. For 150 years or more, the Minneapolis Police Department has been the only means for public safety in the city of Minneapolis. So you're going to have a lot of folks who they don't know what it means to go in a different direction when it comes to public safety. And so when you look at folks who might have a strong opinion one way or the other, I know in my ward, you've got a segment of folks who are absolutely all about abolition now. And you've got a segment of folks who say, that's crazy. We need more police. We need, we don't need to sink the whole ship for one bad apple or whatever, however the saying goes. But mostly what I find is a whole bunch of people who sort of exist in what seems like a paradox to them. And that paradox is, sure, I am afraid of the police, and I am afraid that the police might kill me or my son or my neighbor if I call them. At the same time, I heard gunshots down the block from me last night, and that's also scary. And what do I do about that? I think from there, we have to have a conversation about what safety looks like, what kind of safety the police force has provided historically, and we have to help people come to those conclusions about what a new system could look like. I know that in the wake of the killing of Travis Jordan, who's someone who doesn't get a lot of airtime, but he was killed in North Minneapolis just a year and a half ago. His girlfriend called 911 to say, hey, my boyfriend's threatening to harm himself. He has a knife, and I need help. The police showed up, and they, by the time they got there and through the game of telephone, they understood that there was a man in with a knife with two women in the house, right? Eventually, Travis Jordan was killed by the police because he came out with his knife. Who was served there, right? Most people can recognize that that Travis Jordan wasn't served. He was somebody who was in the throes of a mental health crisis. That his girlfriend and his mom weren't served. They were calling to prevent the eventual outcome. And when you show people examples like that, they come to the reasonable conclusion that, okay, yeah, nobody was served. No public health service was no public safety service was served in that situation. What would have helped Travis Jordan in that situation? What would have produced the outcome that we needed? People do want to see, I think, less investment in a paramilitary force, which is what we've had historically. But they don't want to see less investment in their safety, which a lot of people hold dear to themselves. And so we have to show people what else safety can look like.
And, council member, the measure that was recently introduced by three of your colleagues that you brought up a little bit earlier, my understanding of that is that it went through committee, was voted on in committee. What are the next steps for that piece of for that measure? What's the likelihood of getting passed? What's the timeline for how that goes?
Yeah, so we're going to be taking up that measure, I think, again tomorrow, and taking the vote about whether it should be forwarded to the Charter Commission, and then on the 12th, I think we will be voting to send it to the Charter Commission. And in my mind, this is not necessarily in conflict with the signature campaign. I think that the two measures actually meld well together and don't conflict should they both pass.
Happening tomorrow, how is there an opportunity for the public to get involved in this, to sort of reach out to their council members or to attend these votes, and how can they do that?
Absolutely. We had a public hearing on it already. We got a lot of great turnout, a lot of great opinions on the hearing, and there's a lot of will to get this, I think, on the ballot. I believe the Charter Commission, once the ball's in their court, there will be further opportunity to weigh in, for the public to weigh in, I know that my office, I'm sure the authors will definitely be keeping the public in the loop about when they can participate in those public hearings with the Charter Commission.
And then I've also noticed that in that committee vote, it was almost unanimous except for one committee member. And I don't want you to, don't feel pressure to say mean things about your colleagues, but I'm interested to hear, and I believe that Councilmember was Councilmember Palmisano, who did not vote in favor of this measure. Can you talk a little bit, or did she give any sort of explanation for her opposition? And if you can give us sort of a sense of how many council members sort of agree with that thinking and how you respond to them.
Yeah, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of my colleagues. They're each going to approach this subject with their own rationale. I think the truth is that some of my colleagues don't agree with the direction that the council is headed in. I think that that's a minority of the council. I guess I'll have to we'll be in a position to prove that once this goes to the full council. But some folks think that it is maybe quote unquote reactionary to demand a certain level of change in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. But I actually think that the opposite is true. We've seen, one of the examples that I like to bring up is the Red Summer in Chicago in 1919. And the Illinois Commission on Race Relations that was formed by the governor back then, again, this is 1919, came up with a lot of the same reforms that we're seeing people offering up today. Is 100 years, 101, 102 years long enough to keep having the same reform conversation? I think it's plenty long to have that conversation, and that the time for us to go much further and to take much more meaningful steps is past due, and certainly we certainly should do it now. And
we've also seen that some of the pushback to the original initiative was in part because the Charter Commission said that the state law requires local police departments to fulfill certain functions. And so, sort of as someone who doesn't live in Minneapolis, just thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, why not ask the state? Is that something either of you have tried to go down that path? And do you see state legislators being open to that? And on this one, I'll start with you, Elianne.
Yeah, what I saw play out in Minneapolis and across our state in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings was, I think, the clearest moment of human beings responding to what is clearly a broken system, which is clearly an unreformable system, a system that is not keeping us safe, as Jeremiah spoke to, and that if we are people who care for one another and live in community together, and particularly hold public leadership roles, we have a responsibility to do something in this moment. And there was incredible hope and energy amidst a lot of pain and a lot of trauma this summer. And unfortunately, what has happened is that some elected officials have experienced the public conversation and have relayed the public conversation in a way that didn't lean into the possibility of change, didn't lean into the urgency that they themselves felt in that moment. And they actually shrunk themselves and made themselves small and got trapped by fear. And there are a set of other elected officials and leaders in Minneapolis and across our state who chose the braver, more courageous path, and who said, we cannot go backwards, we must go forwards, and we have a responsibility to our families, our communities, our constituents, our people, to chart a new path forward. And I think it's important to stay grounded there, because what will happen along the sort of political lawmaking process is that everything will get spun to serve an agenda that wants to hold on to the status quo. And my experience of moving policy forward in Minneapolis is that it's very often to get different legal opinions about what is possible and what is not possible. And the machinery inside of the city, and one important piece of this machinery, the Charter Commission, acts to maintain and hold on to the status quo with everything it can. And it actually is not representative of the people of Minneapolis. It's not representative of the will of elected officials' constituents. And it serves to hold on to what currently is. And so as we think about what is the path forward, and as Jeremiah mentioned, we knew that it was possible that the Charter Commission may decide to act small and act scared, and basically pocket veto the first charter amendment. And we also knew that we had to move forward and show what a path forward would look like, and that we had more opportunities to come because this is a long struggle, and that we're not going anywhere, and we're going to continue to fight for a future that reflects our values. And in fact, as poll after poll shows, supermajorities of Minneapolis want to see happen. And so what we know is that we are going to put these questions on the ballot in November, that there is very large support in Minneapolis. We're very, confident in our ability to win. And we know that it will, as we move things forward in the city of Minneapolis, as we set standards in the city of Minneapolis, as we expand what's possible by what we do in the city of Minneapolis, other cities and the state will follow. And so excited to see elected officials from Minneapolis and St. Paul leading at the state level around different reforms, and really educating their colleagues about what a path forward could look like to make sure that we're actually investing in infrastructure that keeps us safe.
I think in the state of Minnesota, we have we have a split House and Senate. We have Republican-controlled Senate, and that makes things really challenging, and I would say, possibly, actually impossible move forward with the state. But it's not just state Republicans. I think to Elianne's point, we also have state electeds who themselves can't imagine what else public safety can look like other than a policing only model. And I think that presents a challenge for us here in Minneapolis. I know that, for instance, when we look at the response to the trial, which I know we probably won't have too much time to get into, it's all barricades and barbed wire, and a lot of that's coming from the Commissioner of Public Safety, the State Commissioner of Public Safety, who's appointed by the governor, right? We have a Democratic governor, and so some of that lack of imagination and some of that lack of political will isn't just coming from state Republicans, but also coming from state Democrats.
So let's then use the imagination we have here in this virtual room. Elianne, let's pretend you're in charge of everything, and you get to implement the sort of whatever vision of public safety you would like to build in Minneapolis. Talk to us about what it would look like.
Yeah, I think at the center of the future of public safety that I want to see in Minneapolis is people. Is a system that says our number one priority is keeping people safe, healthy, and well, and then builds program from there. So what that looks like is programs that support each of us connecting with our neighbors, being in relationship with our neighbors, and taking care of each other when tough things happen. What that looks like is investments in our schools, in after school programs, in our parks, in all the things in our communities that bring us joy, that keep us connected, that bring meaning and happiness into our lives. It looks like investing in public housing and affordable housing so everyone has a safe place to call home. And it looks like making sure that for the hardest moments in our lives, for crisis moments, for emergency moments, there is someone we can call who we have trust will come and help make that situation better and keep us and the people around us safe. And so that's really what I imagine and believe is possible to build in the city of Minneapolis around public safety.
And Councilmember, what do you think it will take to get the city there?
Yeah, I would follow Elianne's leadership any day, and so I appreciate that vision. I think that it starts with where we are right now. It starts with investing in some of the, I guess you could refer to as low-hanging fruit. Making sure that we have a mental health response, making sure that we take non-emergencies off the plate of the police. Because inherently non-emergencies don't belong there in their bucket. I think it means that we're investing in violence prevention. Our Office of Violence Prevention is one of those programs that for years has gotten a lot of public press, but has sort of subsisted on small amounts of money until just this past budget cycle. I think we have to continue leaning into those investments. But then from there, Elianne's absolutely right. We have to make this people-centered. We have to ask questions. In what ways do you expect to be kept safe? And how do we design programming that keeps you safe in that way? One of the things that people, said when we started having this discussion was, well, who's going to solve sexual assault cases? And we had to look at the clearance rate and say, look, 80% of those cases here in Minneapolis go unsolved. Not only that, but repeatedly, victims will either go to the press or go to their council members and say, I felt re-victimized by the police officers that I interacted with. And so we have to ask the question, who is appropriate and who can help keep our communities safe in all of the ways that they expect to be kept safe. I think from there, we're going to find a public safety system that expands well beyond paramilitary, mostly men with guns.
And I want to turn back to something you said a little bit earlier. You mentioned the trial of Derek Chauvin. And this is the police officer who killed George Floyd, and it's set to begin next week in Minneapolis. So can you talk to us a little bit about how you think that will affect the debate over the future of policing in the city?
Yeah, well, I obviously we're all hoping to see justice in this trial. I think that, one of the things that's been really disappointing is that when we should have been prioritizing, I think, healing at this moment, and we should have been affirming the real fear and pain that Derek Chauvin caused. State leadership and the mayor and the county sheriff chose to brace themselves for a war with our residents. I see that reflected in the barricades. I think that this conversation, I unfortunately, I think is going to continue to be really fraught. I think that for those of us that believe that we're on the right path and that we have the best interest of our residents and our constituents in mind, we're going to have to continue to fight hard. And we're not going to be able to sort of get this conversation in a place where everybody just magically agrees with each other. We're going to have to fight really hard for the future that we're envisioning and that we know that our residents deserve.
Elianne, I'm curious to get your thoughts on this too, how you think this trial will sort of shape the discourse and shape the conversation around policing in the city.
Yeah, I agree with everything Councilmember Ellison said, and I think what it does, the fact that the city of Minneapolis, Hennepin County Sheriff's Department, state leaders have been planning a response for months, and their only response is more guns, more police, more military, more helicopters, more barricades, I think actually tells a pretty clear story about the ineffectiveness of that leadership. And the reality that those of us who want more for our community and for our people, and who know that justice is not served by re-traumatizing and over-policing our people, can see that pretty clearly. And so as I talk to my neighbors, my family, Take Action Minnesota members, folks are pretty horrified that this is the sole response, and are really clear that, the way that we are going to keep ourselves safe, the way that we are going to move forward as a community is by investing in healing and restoration, and also action to build the new world. And so what I'm seeing happening in the city of Minneapolis is organizers, activists, healers, and elders and clergy are preparing to do what we do, along with our allied council members, to fill the gaps in the response plan by the mayor and the police chief, and begin to demand more and to show through both our actions as well as our very concrete asks what a different and better response that would actually keep us safe and move us closer to justice as a whole community would look like. And I think that will help really shape up the choice points in our city right now and into the future.
I'm glad that you both brought up the mayor's actions in response to this trial and sort of his choosing, along with other elected leaders, to barricade buildings during this time, to essentially barricade buildings, because I want to ask you both about generally the leadership of the mayor on this issue and how you think it could affect his political future, particularly considering that he's up for re-election this year. Councilmember, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I think that it's no shock to anyone that the mayor and I disagree on what the future of public safety should look like in the city, and we certainly disagree on what trial preparation should have looked like. Just for a little bit of comparison, I went back and I looked at what trial preparations for Jason Van Dyke's trial in Chicago looked like, and they looked nothing like ours, right? And I think that the killing and the murder of Laquan McDonald was horrific and also caught on tape and also rocked that city to its core. You would have thought that maybe we would have turned to the city of Chicago and the leadership at that time to say, how did you guys prepare? But that's not what we did. Instead, I think that we, and I say we as the city, because a lot of council members, especially those who have been dissenting in our opinions, have been increasingly sort of kept intentionally out of those decision-making circles and out of the loop. But it's clear to me that we sort of kind of reduced to our most basic pearl clutching and decided to fortify buildings that we thought were important. That being said, I've always tried to work as best as I can with the mayor, and we're going to continue to disagree. I'm going to continue to lean into political education and ensure that the future that I think that folks deserve is the future that we get. But I don't I don't know what effect it'll have on his political future. I think all of us are in an election year, and we're asking ourselves, did we push too hard on the status quo? And is it going to be those council members who push for change, who lose their elections? Or is it going to be sort of this old guard thinking that loses? I think that's the question that's kind of before us in an election year like this. My hope is that folks realize that these minor changes, that having police, live in the city, which is not even, we can't even lawfully do here in Minneapolis, or having more Black police officers, is not going to fix a system that is completely unaccountable to the people it's meant to serve. I hope folks can recognize that. I'm going to keep doing the work that I have to do. I think the mayor is sincere in his approach to public safety, but I definitely disagree with it.
Yeah, I would say overall, I would characterize the mayor's leadership around transforming and reimagining public safety in Minneapolis as deeply disappointing. And I agree with Councilmember Ellison that there is sincerity there, but there isn't, in my experience, the courage and the clarity to do the hard work and do hard things that would actually lead to change. And instead, what I've seen from the mayor has really been a doubling down on sort of fear-mongering messages and tactics that I can only understand to be designed to keep people scared and build the will to hold on to a police department that is totally unaccountable, that has decades of fact and evidence that it is broken and ineffective, that endlessly abuses its power, and as we saw in this past summer, really operated, for all we could tell as citizens in Minneapolis, outside the chain of any civilian command. That is a pretty terrifying machine to have operating in your city. And so it has been deeply disappointing to not have the mayor lead in a way that really confronted the challenge in front of us and met the moment in a way that helped connect our city, that helped citizens and people in the city sort of chart a path forward together, and that actually helped us get ready to heal, to meet this moment, and to build a brighter future. And I think that as we look towards the election in November, that leadership will be under question, and there are challengers entering the race who are elevating that question and who are making sure it's a conversation we have in our city.
Thank you both so much for joining us, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Minneapolis is closing in on an intense year of activism and demands for policing and public safety, which followed a traumatic year for many people living in Minneapolis after the killing of George Floyd. And in a veto-proof vote over the summer, the city council approved a process that could have began dismantling the police department and replacing it with something that actually prevents violence and brings public safety to the city. But as we've seen in the past, transformative change isn't easy, especially when it hasn't been done before. And so institutional resistance came into play here, among other things. And the Charter Commission has slowed down the momentum of that change. And as our guests told us, despite these obstacles, they're still pushing ahead. There still is a path forward in Minneapolis to have a future where there is a new public safety model that doesn't rely on police violence. And if that signature drive is successful, voters in the city could have the chance to make their voices heard on this subject as early as this year. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on The Appeal Live. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Alana Sivin. We'll see you next time.